Right. So here's the thing about the Saab 900. Your dad probably owned one, or your uncle, or that weird professor you had in college who drove something that looked like nothing else in the parking lot. The one with the ignition key down between the seats where nobody could figure out why it was there. The one that seemed to attract a very specific type of person. Engineers, academics, people who read the manual before they touched anything. People who appreciated that someone, somewhere, had actually thought about why cars were built the way they were, and then decided to do it completely differently. This car was not normal. It was never supposed to be normal. It was built by airplane engineers who looked at the entire automotive industry and essentially said, "You're all doing this wrong." This is motorsport heritage, and I spend way too much time thinking about unconventional engineering decisions that somehow predicted the future. If you're someone who appreciates cars that refuse to follow the rule book, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Look, I want to talk about how a Swedish aircraft manufacturer accidentally created the template for modern turbocharged cars 30 years before anyone else figured it out. How they pioneered safety features that wouldn't become mandatory for decades. How they built something so fundamentally different that it attracted a cult following of people who still argue about it on internet forums today. The Saab 900 wasn't just quirky for the sake of being quirky. It was a preview of where the entire automotive world was heading, built by people who came from outside the industry and brought completely different assumptions about how things should work. Let me take you back to 1947. Sweden, a country that had just spent 6 years watching Europe tear itself apart while trying to maintain neutrality. They had an aircraft manufacturer called Saab, Svenska Aeroplan Aktiebolag, and this company had been building military aircraft throughout the war years. Good ones, planes that worked in the brutal Scandinavian conditions where other aircraft failed. And now the war was over, and there wasn't much demand for military aircraft anymore, and they needed something else to build. So they looked at cars. And here's what most people don't realize about Saab's approach to automotive design. They didn't study what other car manufacturers were doing and try to do it slightly better. They started from scratch, from first principles. They asked what a car actually needed to do, and then they engineered solutions without any of the assumptions that the established automotive industry had accumulated over 50 years. Their first car was called the 92, and it was immediately strange. The entire body was formed from essentially one piece of metal with cutouts for the windows, not stamped panels bolted together like everyone else was doing, one continuous structure like an aircraft fuselage. The engine was a two-stroke two-cylinder, tiny and efficient and weird. Over the years, it evolved into a two-stroke triple, then eventually inherited a four-stroke V4 that was literally 2/3 of a Ford V6 with two cylinders chopped off. The 92, 93, 94, 95, and 96 were all fundamentally the same car, remaining in production for over 30 years with constant improvements throughout, but the same basic platform underneath. This is where it gets really interesting. About halfway through that 30-year production run, Saab introduced their second ever new car. Not their third, not their 10th, their second. This was the 99. Introduced in 1967, and this platform would form the basis of everything Saab would build for the next quarter century. 25 years from one fundamental design. That's not something that happens by accident. That happens because the original design was so fundamentally sound that it kept working even as the automotive world changed around it. Now, you might be thinking that starting from scratch sounds romantic but impractical. Every successful car manufacturer learns from what came before. They iterate, they improve. They don't just ignore decades of accumulated knowledge. And you'd be right about most manufacturers, but Saab's aircraft background gave them something that the established car companies didn't have. They understood structures in a way that car designers simply didn't. Here's the thing about aircraft engineers. They think about crashes constantly. Not crashes as unfortunate events to be survived if possible, but crashes as engineering problems with engineering solutions. In aviation, you design for failure. You assume things will go wrong and you build structures that manage that failure in controlled ways. Load paths, that's the term. Deliberate structural channels that direct impact force through a vehicle in a controlled manner. When an airplane hits turbulence or makes a hard landing, the stress doesn't just randomly distribute through the airframe, it follows engineered paths that spread the load across the strongest parts of the structure. Car manufacturers in the 1960s were not thinking this way. They were building cars that were rigid in some places and flexible in others, based mostly on manufacturing convenience and tradition. Crash safety was an afterthought at best. Saab's engineers looked at this and applied exactly the same thinking they used for aircraft. The 99 featured a 1-inch thick reinforcement running in a perfectly straight line from the top of the A-pillar down to the base of the chassis, purpose-built to protect occupants in a rollover. They tested it by dropping the car from 8 feet in the air. The structure barely noticed. That's not marketing language. They literally hoisted the car up and dropped it, documented the results, and kept improving based on what they learned. The 99 had a structure approximately a third stiffer than other cars on the market. Now, a third stiffer doesn't sound dramatic until you understand what that extra rigidity actually bought them. First, crash safety, obviously, but also something nobody expected. The car didn't squeak, it didn't rattle. The doors closed with a solid thunk instead of a tinny clang. And because the chassis was so rigid, the suspension could do its job properly. The springs and dampers could focus on controlling the wheels instead of compensating for a flexing body structure. The handling was exceptional. All of this from engineers who figured that if you're going to build a structure, you might as well build it right. The 99 lineage introduced a genuinely impressive list of industry firsts, the first ever side impact door beams. Before this car, nobody was putting steel reinforcement inside doors specifically to protect passengers from T-bone collisions. Think about that, something that's now required by law in every car sold anywhere in the developed world. Saab did it first, decades before anyone mandated it, simply because their aircraft engineers thought about what would happen if another car hits you from the side and decided to address it. First, headlight wipers. Yes, really, little wipers for your headlights. This was Sweden. It snows there, a lot. Your headlights get covered in slush and road grime, and suddenly you can't see at night. Saab's solution was elegantly obvious once you thought about it. Put wipers on the headlights, clear the lenses automatically. Simple. The doors extended past the sill. This seems like a tiny detail until you understand why it mattered. When you get out of a car in winter, your pants brush against the door sill. That sill is covered in road salt and snow and dirt. You walk around all day with a gray stripe on your leg. Saab's doors overlapped the sill so your pants stayed clean. Small thing, thoughtful engineering. The kind of detail that only matters if someone actually thinks about how the car will be used in real life. The world's first seat heaters appeared in a Saab. Again, Sweden. Cold. Leather seats in winter feel like sitting on a frozen lake. Your body heat eventually warms them up, but those first 10 minutes are genuinely unpleasant. Saab fixed it with heating elements built into the seat. Now every luxury car has them. Most economy cars have them as options. Saab did it first because they were building cars for people who actually had to live with Scandinavian winters. Activated carbon cabin filtration in the 1960s. When most cars still had vent windows and called it climate control, Saab was filtering the air coming into the cabin, pollen, dust, pollutants from other vehicles. They addressed it decades before anyone else considered it a problem worth solving. The windscreen was curved in a very specific way. It left more room for the driver's head in a crash, while simultaneously providing excellent visibility and improved aerodynamics. One design element, 3 separate benefits. That's efficient engineering. That's not throwing solutions at problems. That's finding solutions that address multiple problems simultaneously. And that distinctive shape at the rear of the car, that concave section that looked like nothing else on the road, that wasn't styling. That wasn't a designer trying to be different for the sake of being different. Saab spent serious time in a wind tunnel in the 1960s studying airflow break over the trailing edge of the roof. They were trying to control wake turbulence, reduce drag, improve fuel efficiency at highway speeds. The shape you see on a classic Saab, that's the result of wind tunnel testing, not design sketches. Form following function in the most literal sense. The 99 also had a flat underbody for aerodynamic efficiency. Saab claimed it was tied with the Citroën DS for the lowest drag coefficient of any car in production. The DS, one of the most aerodynamically advanced cars ever built, a vehicle so ahead of its time that it still looks futuristic today. And Saab said, yeah, we match that. We're right there. These were airplane engineers. They didn't know you weren't supposed to wind tunnel test a family car in 1967. They just did it because it made sense, because that's what you do when you're designing something that moves through air at high speed. Now let me tell you about who actually bought these things, because this is where the Saab story gets genuinely fascinating from a cultural perspective. In 1972, there was a study of university faculty that tracked an uncanny correlation between the car they drove and their political leanings. That year's presidential election was the second largest landslide in American history. Richard Nixon absolutely crushed George McGovern. Only 37.5% of the American public voted for him, 98%. Let that sink in for a moment. The general population went for Nixon by a huge margin. But if you filtered for people who drove Saabs and worked at universities, the result completely inverted. The only group more liberal than Saab drivers were people who had no car at all. There's something almost poetic about that correlation. A car built by Scandinavian engineers, designed with safety and efficiency and thoughtful details as priorities, attracting buyers who thought differently about the world. The car was a statement, even when you weren't trying to make one. You didn't buy a Saab to show off. You bought a Saab because you appreciated that someone had actually thought about the engineering. Here's what most people don't realize about the Saab customer base. These weren't people who bought cars based on status or image in the traditional sense. They were people who read consumer reports, people who researched crash test data before that was a normal thing to do. Engineers who appreciated clever solutions, academics who valued rational design over emotional appeal. The Saab found its audience not through marketing, but through word of mouth among people who actually understood what they were looking at. But here's where Saab really predicted the future, and this is the part that car enthusiasts have been arguing about for decades. In 1978, Saab added a turbocharger to the 99. Now, turbocharged cars existed before this. The Porsche 930 Turbo had arrived a couple of years earlier. The BMW 2002 Turbo had made an appearance. But those were fundamentally different vehicles with fundamentally different philosophies. The Porsche 930 was a purpose-built sports car, wide fenders, whale-tail spoiler, designed to go fast and look like it was going fast. The turbocharger was there to extract maximum performance, to push boundaries, to win races and establish bragging rights. The car was genuinely difficult to drive at the limit because all that power came in suddenly, unexpectedly, in a way that could catch even experienced drivers off guard. Turbo lag followed by explosive thrust. It was exciting, it was dramatic. It was not what most people needed for their daily commute. The Saab 99 Turbo was something else entirely. This was a family car, a practical vehicle with a hatchback and reasonable trunk space and room for passengers. The turbocharger wasn't there to chase lap times or impress anyone at traffic lights. Saab's goal was to maintain the efficiency of a relatively small four-cylinder engine while adding the smooth, effortless torque of a much larger engine. Think about that philosophy for a moment. Don't make the engine bigger, don't add more cylinders, don't accept the fuel economy penalty that comes with displacement. Keep the small, efficient engine and just make it work harder when you actually need the power. During normal driving, you have a fuel-efficient four-cylinder. When you need to merge onto a highway or pass a slower vehicle, the turbocharger spools up and suddenly you have the thrust of something much larger. This is exactly how modern cars work. Every turbocharged four-cylinder on the road today follows this exact philosophy. Your average crossover SUV runs a 2-liter turbo because it gives you 6-cylinder power with 4-cylinder fuel economy. The hot hatchbacks everyone loves, turbocharged 4s. The sports sedans from BMW and Audi and Mercedes, turbocharged 4s and 6s. Even pickup trucks are moving to turbocharged engines for the same reason: efficiency during normal operation, power when you need it. Saab figured this out in 1978, 45 years ago. They established the recipe for modern engine design before most manufacturers had even started thinking about it. Not turbocharging for racing, not turbocharging for bragging rights, turbocharging as a practical solution to the efficiency versus power trade-off that every car manufacturer faces. The 99 Turbo only lasted a year in production before being replaced by the 900. And the 900 is where this whole philosophy came together into something genuinely remarkable, something that would stay in production for 15 years and influence automotive design for decades after that. From the driver's seat rearward, the 900 was essentially identical to the 99. Same greenhouse, same doors, same body panels, same hatchback. They didn't change anything that was already working. The improvements focused on the front end, where new United States crash regulations required modifications. The wheelbase stretched by 2 inches, the front end extended by 8 inches. That critical rollover load path now formed a Z shape instead of a straight line, but it was still there, still doing its job, still protecting occupants in ways that other manufacturers hadn't even considered. Every feature from the 99 carried over. The door beams, the headlight wipers, the cabin filtration, the thoughtful details, and the turbocharging technology continued to evolve, getting more sophisticated with each model year. Let me explain this engine layout because it's genuinely one of the strangest configurations in automotive history. The 900 is a front-wheel drive car, pretty normal for the era, but the engine sits longitudinally, front to back, the way it would sit in a rear-wheel drive car, and it's located almost entirely in front of the front axle. Most of the engine's mass is ahead of the wheels. This is unusual but not unheard of. What makes it truly weird is the orientation. The engine is turned around 180 degrees, backwards, and it's leaned over at a 45-degree angle. Why 45 degrees? Because the 99's original engine was derived from half of a Triumph Stag V8. V8 engines use 90-degree cylinder banks. Cut a 90-degree V8 in half, and you get a 45-degree slant 4. The angle wasn't a design choice for the Saab specifically. It was inherited from the engine's origins. The engine drives the transmission via a chain, not a direct connection, not gears meshing together. A chain, like on a motorcycle, transferring power from the crankshaft to the gearbox. This arrangement created some interesting service situations that Saab owners became intimately familiar with over the years. Doing a clutch replacement on a Saab 900 was actually easier than replacing the timing belt. On most cars, the clutch is buried deep in the drivetrain. You have to drop the transmission, separate it from the engine, access the flywheel. It's a major job. On the Saab 900, the clutch was reasonably accessible. You could get to it without completely disassembling the front of the car. The exhaust routing, though. The exhaust routing is something that engineers probably lost sleep over. The exhaust exits the side of the cylinder head and travels forward toward the headlight area. It encounters the turbocharger, then makes a complete U-turn and passes within approximately a 1/4 inch of the battery's warning sticker about heat exposure. A 1/4 inch. Then it finally routes toward the rear of the car where it belongs. If you've ever wondered why Saab owners developed reputations for being particular about maintenance, this is why. The car rewarded attention and punished neglect. You couldn't ignore service intervals. You couldn't skip the little things. The engineering was brilliant, but demanded respect. Now here's where the Saab turbo system became genuinely innovative in ways that wouldn't be fully appreciated for decades. Because it wasn't just adding a turbocharger to an existing engine. That's the easy part. Anyone can bolt a turbo onto an engine and call it a day. The challenge is making it work properly across all conditions. Saab developed something called APC, Automatic Performance Control. This was the first system in automotive history to automatically reduce boost pressure in response to engine knock. Knock, for those unfamiliar, happens when fuel ignites prematurely from heat and pressure instead of from the spark plug. It's bad, very bad. It damages pistons, it damages bearings, it can destroy an engine quickly if left unchecked. And turbocharged engines are particularly prone to knock because the compressed air charge coming from the turbocharger is hot. Most turbocharged engines of that era dealt with knock risk by running extremely low compression ratios. The Porsche 911 Turbo ran a compression ratio of 6.5 to 1, very low. This gave the engine room to add boost without the air-fuel mixture getting hot enough to detonate prematurely. Low compression means less heat buildup, means less knock risk. Simple physics. The problem with low compression is efficiency.
When you're not using the turbocharger, when you're just cruising along at steady speeds, that low compression ratio means the engine isn't extracting as much energy from each combustion event as it could. You're leaving efficiency on the table. You're burning more fuel than necessary during the majority of your driving when you don't actually need the turbo's extra power. The Saab 900 turbo, toward the end of its production run, had a compression ratio of 9:1. That's a massive difference from the Porsche's 6.5. High compression means better efficiency during normal driving. You're not wasting energy compressing air more than necessary. But it also means more knock risk when the turbocharger starts pushing additional air into the cylinders. The APC system solved this elegantly. It monitored for knock using sensors on the engine block. When it detected any knock occurring, it automatically reduced boost pressure by opening the wastegate and bleeding off exhaust energy. The turbocharger slowed down, boost dropped, knock stopped. When conditions allowed, boost would build back up. The system constantly adjusted in real time based on what the engine was actually experiencing. This meant Saab could run high compression for efficiency during normal driving, then still add turbo boost for power without destroying the engine. The car could even run on low-octane fuel if that's all you could find. It would just make less power because the system would detect knock earlier and limit boost accordingly. Fill it with premium high-octane fuel, and the system would let the turbocharger work harder before intervening. This was sophisticated engine management in an era when most cars still had carburetors and mechanical distributors. Electronic fuel injection was just becoming common. Computer-controlled ignition timing was cutting edge. And Saab had a knock-sensing boost management system that automatically optimized performance based on fuel quality and ambient conditions. The wastegate design itself was also unusual in ways that affected how the car actually drove. Most turbo systems regulate boost by monitoring intake manifold pressure. More pressure in the intake means more boost, which means you open the wastegate to bleed off exhaust gases and slow the turbocharger down. It's a reactive system. Boost builds, system responds, boost stabilizes.
Saab's wastegate reacted to exhaust pressure instead of intake pressure. This might seem like a minor technical detail, but it fundamentally changed the character of power delivery. By responding to exhaust pressure, the system anticipated boost buildup rather than reacting to it. The result was smoother power delivery, less of that sudden surge that characterized other turbocharged cars of the era. The Saab turbo's torque curve more closely resembled a larger naturally aspirated motor than a typical turbocharged engine. Peak boost was only about 8 to 10 pounds per square inch, not high by sports car standards. The Porsche 930 was running significantly more boost. Even economy turbos today often run higher pressures. This modest boost level meant the Saab didn't produce huge horsepower numbers. When the APC system first came out, the turbocharged engine made 135 horsepower compared to the naturally aspirated version's 110, 25 extra horsepower. Not exactly earth-shattering on paper, but here's what the raw numbers don't tell you. The turbo added its power exactly where you needed it during real-world driving, down low in the rev range, at the engine speeds you actually use when accelerating from a stop, merging onto highways, passing slower traffic. That modest top-end horsepower difference didn't matter much because you spent most of your driving time in the part of the power band where the turbocharger was actually helping. And, importantly, the car wasn't sluggish off boost. This was the high compression advantage in action. Most turbocharged engines of that era felt lazy and unresponsive until boost built up. You'd press the accelerator and wait for the exhaust to spin up the turbine, wait for the compressor to pressurize the intake, wait for the additional air to translate into additional power. Turbo lag, they called it. Some cars had lag measured in full seconds, very noticeable, very annoying in daily driving. The Saab's high compression ratio meant the engine made decent power even before the turbo came into play. It didn't feel like it was waiting for something to happen. It felt like a good engine that happened to have more to give when you asked for it. The turbocharger was a bonus, not a requirement. This is exactly how modern turbocharged engines behave. Small displacement for efficiency, high compression for throttle response, electronic boost management to prevent knock, tuned for real-world usable power rather than peak horsepower numbers that only matter at full throttle near redline.
Every manufacturer figures this out eventually. BMW's current turbocharged engines work this way. Mercedes, Audi, Volkswagen, Toyota, Honda, everyone. Small turbo 4s and 6s with high compression and sophisticated knock management. The Saab 900 Turbo got there in 1978, decades ahead of the curve, and they did it not because they were trying to win races or impress automotive journalists, but because they were trying to solve a practical problem. How do you make a car that's efficient during normal driving but powerful when you need it? Turbocharging with high compression and electronic boost control. Saab's answer became the industry's answer, eventually.
Now let's talk about the interior, because this was another area where Saab's aircraft heritage showed through in ways that other manufacturers simply weren't considering. The dashboard wasn't designed by automotive stylists. Fighter jet cockpit designers worked on the layout. People who understood that the pilot, or in this case the driver, needed to access information and controls without taking attention away from the primary task. The result wrapped around the driver in a way that felt purposeful rather than decorative. Controls were positioned for easier access and better peripheral visibility. The most frequently used items were closest to the driver's natural line of sight: climate controls, radio, essential switches. You didn't have to hunt around the dashboard while driving. Your hand went where it needed to go almost instinctively. The radio was positioned up high, near the top of the center stack. This seems completely obvious now. Every modern car puts the infotainment screen at eye level. But in the 1970s and early 1980s, other manufacturers routinely placed radios down low on the dashboard, sometimes almost at the floor. You'd have to take your eyes completely off the road to change a radio station. Look down, find the correct button, look back up. Hope nothing had happened while you weren't watching. Saab put the radio where you could see it with a glance. A quick flick of the eyes downward, not a full head movement. It's the kind of detail that seems insignificant until you consider it from a safety perspective. Every second your eyes are off the road is a second something can go wrong. Multiply that by all the radio adjustments over years of driving and the difference adds up. The gauges were designed for clarity, large, easy to read, positioned directly in front of the driver where they belonged. The speedometer and tachometer dominated the view because those were the instruments you actually needed to monitor while driving. Secondary information was present but not competing for attention. Aircraft instrument design principles applied to automotive use. The emergency brake worked on the front wheels. Now this sounds wrong because virtually every other car uses a rear emergency brake. The rear wheels lock, the car stops. Simple enough. But think about the Saab's weight distribution. With that engine mounted almost entirely ahead of the front axle, the car had approximately 60% of its weight over the front wheels. When you park on a hill, which wheels are better equipped to hold the car in place? The ones with more weight pressing down on them. Physics says the front wheels can generate more friction because they're carrying more of the vehicle's mass, so Saab put the parking brake there. It worked better for their specific vehicle layout. They did change this to rear-wheel operation for 1988, probably because mechanics outside of Sweden were tired of explaining why the emergency brake was different from every other car they worked on. Sometimes being unconventional creates more problems than it solves, even when the unconventional approach is technically superior. The ignition was positioned between the seats, down by the floor console near the driver's right knee. This is probably the detail that most people remember about classic Saabs, that weird key location. Why would anyone put the ignition down there when every other car in the world puts it on the steering column? Several reasons, actually. To remove the key, you had to have the transmission in reverse gear. Then the shifter stayed locked in reverse with the key removed. Multiple purposes here. First, drivers in Sweden often didn't need to use the handbrake in icy conditions because the transmission lock held the car in place. Handbrake cables tend to freeze in extreme cold. Water gets in, temperatures drop, suddenly your handbrake is stuck on or stuck off. Neither is good. The transmission lock avoided this problem entirely. Second, the car couldn't roll away if someone accidentally bumped the shifter into neutral. It was locked in reverse. Reverse gear acts as its own brake on a manual transmission car. The engine provides resistance through the drivetrain. You'd have to deliberately insert the key and move the shifter before the car could move.
Third, and this is the aircraft engineer thinking again, the key location moved a hard object away from an area that body parts would occupy during a crash. In a frontal impact, the driver's knees come forward. They hit things, the steering column, the dashboard, whatever's in that area. A protruding ignition key near your knee becomes a hazard during a collision, something that concentrates impact force into a small area, something that can cause injuries that wouldn't happen if the key simply wasn't there. Saab moved the key somewhere it couldn't hurt you. They thought about where body parts would be during an impact and deliberately removed hard objects from those areas. This is safety engineering that goes beyond crumple zones and airbags. It's thinking about the human body's interaction with the vehicle interior during an accident. It's the attention to detail that comes from engineers who approach every problem systematically, rather than accepting conventional solutions because that's how things have always been done. Now, you might be wondering how the platform designed in 1967 could still be competitive in the late 1980s. That's a 20-year-old fundamental design competing against cars engineered a decade or more later. Other manufacturers had moved on. They developed new platforms with new technologies. They had the advantage of learning from 2 decades of automotive advancement. How could the 900 possibly keep up? The answer lies in how right Saab got the fundamentals from the beginning. The structure was so well designed that it aged gracefully. The packaging was so clever that it remained practical even as competitors caught up in various ways. The driving experience was so good that people kept choosing it over newer alternatives. Here's a remarkable fact that tells you everything you need to know about how the market received this car. Saab reported sales increases every single month for 60 consecutive months from 1982 to 1987. Every month, 5 years straight. Sales went up on a car based on a platform that was already 20 years old at that point. That doesn't happen with normal cars. Normal cars hit their peak and decline. The market moves on. Newer designs come out with more features and fresher styling, and the old model fades away. Dealers start discounting heavily. Buyers wait for the next generation. The product life cycle follows a predictable curve downward. The 900 didn't follow that curve. It kept finding new buyers year after year. People who appreciated what it offered. People who compared it to the supposedly more modern competition and decided the Saab was actually the better car. People who understood that a 20-year-old platform designed by aircraft engineers could still be superior to a 5-year-old platform designed by conventional automotive thinking.
Automotive journalist David E. Davis wrote about the 900 Turbo in 1982 for a major publication. His description captures something about the car that specifications and feature lists simply cannot convey. He called it a Mercedes-Benz that wandered out of the house one night during an acid experience and was never quite the same again. It existed in an altered state, he said. A marvelous blend of solid citizen daytime values with a proclivity for the occasional breach of the peace. His conclusion about the Turbo version specifically, it was a safe, practical car that you and your mom and the kids could use to escape from the cops. That line captures the duality perfectly. Responsible engineering married to unconventional execution. A car for people who wanted something thoughtful and sensible, but absolutely refused to be boring. A vehicle that could serve as reliable family transportation while harboring capabilities that might surprise anyone who made assumptions based on its practical appearance. The Saab 900 Turbo wasn't trying to be a sports car pretending to be a family sedan. It wasn't a family sedan with a sporty trim package bolted on to attract younger buyers. It was something genuinely different, a category of one. A car that took the entire automotive formula and rethought it from first principles without abandoning the practical requirements that most people actually need from a vehicle. Should safety be a compromise between protection and weight and cost? Saab said no. They engineered load paths and door beams and rollover protection because protecting occupants was a fundamental requirement, not an optional extra. Should efficiency require sacrificing power? Saab said no. They pioneered practical turbocharging that gave you both, adjusting automatically based on conditions. Should good handling require a harsh ride that punishes passengers on rough roads? Saab said no. They built a stiffer structure that let the suspension do its job properly.
Should the driver adapt to the car's layout because that's how cars have always been designed? Saab said absolutely not. They hired fighter jet cockpit designers to make the car adapt to the driver. Controls where you could reach them, instruments where you could see them, hazards removed from areas where body parts would go during a crash. Every assumption that the automotive industry had accumulated over decades of building cars the same way, Saab questioned. Not all of their answers were right. Some of their engineering decisions created maintenance challenges that frustrated owners and mechanics alike. That backwards-leaning engine with exhaust routing past the battery wasn't exactly mechanic-friendly. Accessing certain components required unconventional approaches that someone trained on normal cars wouldn't immediately understand. But the fundamental philosophy was sound. Start with what the driver and passengers actually need. Work backward from there to engineering solutions. Don't accept limitations just because everyone else has accepted them. Challenge conventional thinking, not for the sake of being different, but because conventional thinking might be wrong.
This is why people sometimes compare Saab to Tesla when discussing disruptive approaches to automotive design. Not because of electric drivetrains, obviously. The 900 ran on gasoline like everything else of its era, but because of the philosophical approach to the problem. Coming from outside the traditional automotive industry, questioning assumptions that insiders took for granted, prioritizing different things than the established manufacturers, finding customers who appreciated the different perspective even when it created some inconveniences. Tesla came from Silicon Valley and asked why cars couldn't work like computers. Software updates, touchscreen interfaces, over-the-air improvements. They brought technology industry assumptions to vehicle design. Saab came from aircraft manufacturing and asked why cars couldn't work like airplanes. Structural integrity, load paths, cockpit ergonomics, attention to what happens during failures. They brought aviation engineering assumptions to vehicle design. Both approaches found customers who valued the different perspective. People who didn't want the same thing everyone else was buying. People who appreciated that someone had actually thought about the problems, rather than just iterating on existing solutions. People who were willing to accept some quirks and inconveniences in exchange for genuine innovation. The 900 ended production in 1993, replaced by a new platform that shared components with General Motors vehicles. Saab had been acquired, partially at first and then completely, by GM during the late 1980s and early 1990s. The corporate parent saw opportunities for platform sharing and parts commonality. The next generation Saab would be based on GM architecture rather than unique Swedish engineering. Saab continued for another 2 decades after the 900's departure, producing vehicles that maintained some of the brand's character while increasingly sharing their fundamental structures with other GM products. The 93 and 95 were good cars in many respects. They carried forward Saab's safety focus and turbocharged engine philosophy. But they weren't quite the same as the cars designed entirely by aircraft engineers working without corporate constraints. The brand finally closed in 2012, a victim of corporate ownership changes and the 2008 financial crisis and shifting market conditions that no longer favored small premium manufacturers without massive global scale. GM sold Saab, the new owners struggled, and eventually there was no path forward. The factories in Trollhättan went silent. The story ended. But the ideas pioneered in the 99 and 900, those live on in every modern car.